All right, so all day we've been talking about safety planning and leading up to this and mentioning how it's part of the CPGs and really another point in terms of your suicide risk assessment. I was sitting down, so I didn't get to see it as well, but how many people have done a safety plan with an individual or patient before? Maybe I should do the reverse. How many people don't have experience with safety plan? Okay, so what I hope to do is obviously hit the highlights of the safety plan, talk about tips or tricks, and then also hit on this idea of evidence-based practices being even embedded within the safety plan in and of itself. So we talked about how these interventions that Nazi was just talking about are more sort of chronic, long-term, but how the safety plan can be so effective in the acute, especially if we add or sort of supercharge it with some of these ideas, concepts, components of empirically based treatments as well. And again, keeping this within a manageable time frame. So working collaboratively with a veteran, completing a safety plan that may take 20, 45 minutes actually is invaluable time in terms of what we know and how effective it can be, especially with the means restriction. So I hope to convince you by the end of this, many of you are doing it, but maybe that you'll even do it a little bit more, have some new ways to implement things within the safety plan. But, I mean, one of the challenges and why the safety plan comes up is, how can an individual manage a crisis in the moment that it happens? And then the next point is how we as providers, clinicians, therapists, help that veteran within that moment. And so I'll suggest that the safety plan, especially a well-developed collaborative safety plan between you and the veteran, can serve that purpose and be so efficacious. Safety plan that we've been talking about is a brief intervention. We sometimes refer to it as a standalone intervention in and of itself. Again, really helping with this acute notion as well. It follows risk assessment. It's hierarchical, so it helps in terms of an individual that's in a crisis sometimes isn't using their best thinking. So by having it laid out ahead of time for them in steps that progress more and more kind of support needed, it's hierarchically organized in that fashion. It's useful, obviously, preceding a suicidal crisis, but also during, so it can serve both purposes, especially if you work with someone over time. If they get really good at their safety plan, they're doing it effortlessly, and they're doing it way before the fact, so they're not even peaking within a crisis. And that's when it's going to be even more helpful. And, like we said, all of us have our own little points of if there's one thing to take away, there's the green box. But in the safety planning section is this sort of red idea here of doing this collaboratively. If we think back to that Ganzini research that I talked about, the qualitative study of what works and what doesn't work, one thing they talked about in terms of the veterans saying, when the provider actually turns away from me and they're working on the computer, I don't feel connected. I'm not going to feel as comfortable talking about my suicide, about my suicidal thoughts. And so, again, just as simple as doing this collaboratively, we'll talk about how to do that can play a major role. So just a little point here on no suicide contracts. How many people remember the days of using no suicide contracts? So I think it's pretty fair to say that pretty much those days are gone, and which is a good thing, because we know that they don't work. And the reason why they don't work is that the no suicide contracts, even if somebody was well-meaning and really well-intentioned, it doesn't help them know what to do in a suicidal crisis or how to help themselves. And so that's why we think that they especially don't work. And the caveat behind that is I think as providers it provided a false sense of assurance to us. Like, oh, if someone signs that paper, then we'll be okay, we'll be off the hook. And it turns out that that isn't the case. And also we're not doing the best for our veterans or our patients by using the safety plan, which tells them what to do and how to do that. We're taking that extra step to really be there for them. Whoa, look at collaboration comes up again. So I can't say that that's the only time we'll see it again, but there it is. So in terms of tips on how to do this, you'll read this and you're like, come on, why does somebody put this on a slide? They're so basic and straightforward, but I think sometimes, especially when we're super busy, we have lots of demands as clinicians, all the stuff is on the computer too, that we can get away from some of these basic things that can be so powerful and influential. So something like sitting side by side, actually using a paper form of the safety plan, so not just putting it into the computer, but kind of printing out that form or that template, having the individual write themselves. So there's a big thing about it being their own handwriting and even their own words. Like the way that I talk about stuff is probably very different than a way the veteran may put that same information down on the form. And then finally, what we're going to do is making this a little bit more advanced and just going through the safety plan is also thinking about how can we address barriers and how can we problem solve around that. So that's sort of the next step within the safety plan. Anybody can put down a bunch of stuff on a safety plan, probably do it within 5-10 minutes, be like, oh yeah, that sounds good. But have you checked, will this work? What would be potentially difficult to try that coping strategy when you're feeling suicidal, and taking that next step and helping the individual problem solve through that. So 6 steps for the safety plan. Again, not too in-depth, sort of crazy concepts here. But what I want you to think about, too, is thinking of this as a fluid process. So similar to the notions that we have for recovery within the VA system, how can you think about even recovery in terms of the safety plan? Especially if we're thinking about these empirically based treatments and having these components within each step, how can we make this a more fluid process that, again, is this ongoing dialogue where the veteran not only has skills to help themselves in the moment, but can continue to keep improving on each of these factors, adding things to their safety plan, really buffing it up. So the biggest thing, I'll probably spend the most time talking about this, is the rationale. So in my opinion, if a really strong rationale is presented, especially in a collaborative way, of course you're going to have buy-in for the safety plan in immense ways than if you didn't use the rationale. And I think this is, again, not a surprising concept to people, too, with the interventions we use, that if we really spend time talking about the rationale, why it works, why it would help that particular veteran, we're going to have a greater chance of them being motivated and engaged in treatment. And the same is true here for the rationale for the safety plan. I know previously, before I had come to the Denver VA, I had seen people use safety plans and there was no rationale. It's sort of like, this is a thing that'll help you, and like, you know, we need to do it before you leave. And I was like, that's not good. So it's like the opposite of what you want to do. But spending time talking about one of these rationales I'm going to go into here in a second can be, again, so effective. And what I like to do is kind of decide with the veteran that I'm working with which one will probably work best for them. So we'll see how a little of them, some of them are similar in terms of the concepts behind them, but slightly different twists. So the first thing that I do when I'm working with someone with a safety plan, I say, what's your thinking like in a crisis? And people are like, oh, it's all over the place, it's really fast, it's really sloppy, there's lots of different answers. But the basic gist is your thinking isn't the same when you're in a crisis and when you're not in a crisis. That's going to be true for everyone. Usually you can get pretty good agreement with that. And so what I do is I talk with people about the concept of the fight or flight response. And especially with our veterans, I think they really buy into that because they have training on that, they get that. So when we're in a crisis or we're activated in some way, we're in a lot of emotional distress, our body's kicking in with a response to keep us safe. And actually what's happening during that time is a different part of our brain is working. So the frontal area of our brain that really does our good planning and really sophisticated thinking goes offline. We start using sort of the core pieces of our brain during that time. So it makes sense that it would be extremely difficult, Mr. So-and-so, when you're in this crisis, because even your brain's sort of rewired. So what the goal is then, we're working on the safety plan now. When you're not in a crisis, we can use some of our best thinking, and then the game plan's on a piece of paper ready for you to go if you find yourself in that place again. People are usually like, oh, that makes sense to me. Another one I like to use, which is more of a sort of cute one, do people remember, especially in elementary school, how you would practice stop, drop, and roll for if you catch on fire? How many people? Like, I remember doing that, like thinking of my little self, like falling down. We practice it so much. And so, I bring up this concept, and usually people, I've noticed that some of the younger veterans are sort of like, I don't know what she's talking about. So I'm not sure if this is widely practiced anymore, so this may be something to think about for those that are in the older generations. So, you say, well, you practice this over and over again, but usually what are people's first instinct when they're on fire? Is to run, which is like the whole opposite of all that practicing. But even still, I guarantee there are probably some kids that, I hope that this isn't the case, but caught on fire, and even if they practice, I bet there was an instinct to run. And so the same thing here, that if we're in a crisis, we're going to go back to those sort of learned behaviors, what our instinct is. And so for the most part, if someone hasn't used a safety plan before, you're going to try the things that you tried before that maybe didn't work so well. So what about using something like this where we practice over and over again so that you can override that instinct, similar to the stop, drop, and roll analogy? Another one that works extremely well, especially if you're working with a veteran that's still really tied to their military service or really sees that as a core part of who they are, is talking about SOPs, so standard of practice. So, I mean, SOPs are everything when they're serving in the military. And so it would be unheard of if they entered some kind of dangerous mission without having an SOP in place. Even if they knew what to do or how to do it, that still was always there. And so it's similar for this. You know, you may have the skills, strategies, techniques, but why don't we have a plan in place so that when you're in a crisis that you can go to that? You would never have thought of or dreamed of putting yourself into a dangerous situation without a plan. Could we think of this as the same way? A suicidal crisis is pretty dangerous, or even if you're feeling distressed, here's a plan that we can have in place that you can use. Another thing to talk about, and this is sometimes helpful to draw this, so this is a graph here of poorly illustrated, me freehanding in paint that didn't go so well, but I hope it gets the idea. So it's duration of crisis here, intensity of crisis. So you can imagine a crisis being symbolic of a normal curve. So if we catch it early, which is the whole concept of the safety plan, as early as you can, notice that something's not quite the same, and we intervene at that early point, we're going to have, this should be a little bit more gradual breakdown. So you're not going to hit the peak as fast, your peak's not going to be as high, and it's going to be a slower wave out. And so, again, this rationale, one, buys in sort of participation by the veteran, but also you can use it with some of this problem solving. So as we go through, lots of times, I'm sure many of you, when you safety plan with people, are like, oh, well, X, Y, and Z. If you go back to the rationale, it can sometimes help you, and I'll talk about that here in a second. So step one, warning signs. So it's pretty straightforward. You want to help people know what are those earliest signs, those clues that distress is coming, that you're not quite yourself. One thing that I think is really helpful, and again, this is sort of some of those tips and tricks, sometimes people, especially if they've been chronically suicidal and they really don't see any fluctuation, is to ask, what do others notice about you that's different? And sometimes that's more helpful for them to think about it. The empirically based sort of treatment you can think of here could kind of go to some of the ACT pieces of this idea of mindfulness, of being sort of outside of your thoughts, your mind in the moment, to take a step back to be able to monitor what's going on for you. But what I know is sort of my number one thing that happens. People always say, well, Sarah, I don't have any warning signs. I go from 0 to 10 in, snap of a finger. So how many people have been in this situation before? Maybe not even outside of safety planning. And I think this can be a tricky one. How have people handled this before?
I said things like, it may feel that way, but it's probably because you haven't been paying attention to the process.
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest things throughout all of this is normalizing and validating that, I bet it does feel that way, especially when you're overwhelmed with these emotions. How can we think about maybe attuning to them a little bit better that you may not have just caught them yet?
I say something about the brain works a lot faster than you think, and that little bit of time that seems just like this, you want to stretch it out a little bit, catch yourself and take a look at what's happening then.
Yeah, so this idea that the brain is working fast, which is true, again, going back to that fight or flight response, so we want to catch it to help slow it down, to see what that is. Yeah.
Asking what happened right before you went from 0 to 10. So helping them see that there was probably smaller things that were leading up to that and it wasn't quite as sudden.
Exactly, so asking them what happened right before, and I think that's one of the most effective things. Because when people think about the suicidal crisis and the safety plan, they're thinking about like that peak, where it's really intense, it's really tough, and it does go really quick, but helping them sort of go back in time and say, well, what sorts of things were happening that day, or even that week before these things were happening, will help with that perspective. So I think, again, warning signs, I probably spend the most amount of time on that, because if you go back to this idea or the rationale that you need to catch it early, if you have really good warning signs identified, it can be so helpful. So really helping people think across a continuum, so thoughts, sensations, behaviors, feelings, emotions, identifying all of those, even as straightforward as putting down the safety plan, having the thought that X, Y, Z. It's also helpful to help people build in even a continuum within the warning signs. So maybe lots of the top two that I often get is isolation and substance use. And so I'll talk to them, well, what does isolation look like for you, to make sure it's personalized and specific? But then also, what are all the steps within isolation? Because oftentimes it'll be, well, you know, I don't start calling people as much, and then I don't go out of the house as often, and then I'm not leaving the house at all, then I'm just staying in my room. So for example, there's a continuum that can be built in even within the warning signs, backing it up to catch it early. So the second step is coping strategies. So what are things that the person can do in the moment to take their mind off the suicidal thoughts? So, I mean, there's pretty straightforward questions here. What types of things have you found helpful in trying to distract yourself? And the biggest thing are, these are things that individuals can do without contacting other people. So it could be things like DBT skills, so distress tolerance, mindfulness skills, deep breathing, simple things like exercise. So I often talk about the individuals how just physiologically changing your body temperature can be so key and helpful in mood management. Again, just acutely. I always stress that things that we list in step 2 aren't going to solve the problem. So oftentimes people will be in that time, that sort of space in their mind. Well, you know, deep breathing is not going to help me figure out how to get my job back. It's like, no, you're right. It's not going to help you in that moment. But again, we want to do things on the short-term acute state to buy you time, to let that crisis wave flow out a little bit more. And what's really nice about this step, and especially as you're working with people over time, is it really promotes self-efficacy regarding suicidal thoughts. So helping people build things that they feel comfortable with on step 2 over time in terms of intervention can be so immensely helpful, both in the short term, because it's helping them distract themselves, but also longer term, it's teaching them ways to handle their suicidal thoughts and not go down that same road. Big thing here, though, is making sure that you problem solve around the barriers. So how likely do you think you'll be able to do X in a time of crisis? Or what's going to stand in the way of these activities or doing them? And this is critical. So I'll have people sometimes I work with that just make a beautiful list for step 2. Sometimes they're really extravagant things. Sometimes even they're more basic things. And then I ask this question, like, oh, actually, I don't have the stuff to do that. I don't have a car, so I can't go there. And it just, you know, kind of melts away. So really helping them think about what things will actually work is critical here. And so there are a couple kind of tips and tricks I think about as well. Is I always help people think about making sure that they're putting things on step 2 that they know really well, they know works for them, they're comfortable with. So I always give the example, I've never like rollerbladed or roller skated my entire life. Like I've never done that. I think I've ice skated maybe twice. So it'd be a horrible idea for me on my safety plan to put down like step 2 coping strategy, like go rollerblading. Like 1, I don't have the stuff. 2, it's gonna, I mean maybe I'd be awesome at it, but I'm gonna guess based on my ice skating experiences that I'm not, that it's gonna end not so great, and it's probably gonna intensify my crisis. So I give sort of that silly example, which is actually pretty true, to make sure that people are putting things down that, 1, they have, that's what I mean for preparation, they have the stuff if they need to use it, and then 2, they know that it works for them. What can be really helpful that we do with some of our group work is actually providing a list, an emotion regulation handout list, so that people can start thinking about things that may work for them, that they could engage in terms of just behavioral activation, which we know would be good for their mood, and then they could make their way onto the safety plan. And in terms of behavioral activation, sort of a sophisticated or more advanced portion of this step is making sure that people are listing things that are based on their values. So things that are important or meaningful to them in some way can also be really helpful for step 2. So step 3 is now social distraction. So people that you can reach out to for distraction, or places that involve people sort of being around that again would just use social distraction to ride out that wave of the crisis. So you could ask, who helps take your mind off problems? Who do you enjoy socializing with? Where can you go to have the opportunity to be around people in a safe environment? And a couple of things that come into play here is really stressing that at step 3, this is not for support. You're not disclosing that you're in a suicidal crisis. You're basically just calling someone up to shoot the breeze with. So I'll give an example. You know, I have some friends that I would call up to, you know, talk about sports with, but some of those people would be awful to call if I needed help with my problem. But they'd be great for step 3, because we can talk on and on about some kind of topic. We'll also talk about, for step 3 and step 4, avoiding controversial relationships. So if something is a rocky relationship, sometimes people aren't great support. It's actually better to leave it blank than put down somebody that someone would feel comfortable or confident in calling, or feel that they'd be trustworthy as well. So step 4 now, we're moving to actual disclosure that we're in a distress or crisis. So this is helping people think about who's supportive, to reach out to in times of crisis, who can they trust, who gives them good advice. Could be the same people as step 3, but could be different because of the purpose is different. One thing I encourage, and we'll talk about here in a second for troubleshooting, is oftentimes people will say, well, I don't want to be a burden, or I don't want to call someone up, they don't know how to help me at that time, and so I'll really work with them. Well, do you feel comfortable telling them about the plan, maybe sharing the plan with them, troubleshooting it before you call them up? And usually that will help alleviate that fear. And again, this idea of better to leave it blank, because the safety plan is set up that they could just move on to the next step if they don't have someone for step 4. And then maybe a long-term intervention goal is setting up support that would make their way on to step 4. Step 5, professionals, so that's you guys. Sometimes this section is filled out for people already. I'm not going to go into detail here, but you know, providers, as well as urgent care, 911. This is where I take the opportunity to really highlight the crisis line. We have some cards back there, and you guys may be familiar. There's, of course, the phone, but there's also now a web chat option as well as texting, so that's sometimes attractive to different people. If they don't want to call up when they're in a crisis, they could use the web chat or text. I always make sure to stress that they press 1, which gets them to the veteran side of things. There's less of a wait. There's also increased likelihood that they may speak with a veteran themselves, which sometimes is attractive to folks. And then I really stress this idea of early and often. So if you think about the 6 steps of the safety plan, professionals are coming in 5. So it is very appropriate and pertinent for someone to use the crisis line at this point. But the reason why they changed it from the suicide hotline to the crisis line is that so people can call whenever, wherever, sort of at any time, right? So if you don't have a lot of individuals listed for step 3 and 4, think about using the crisis line earlier. Think about using the crisis line when you're even feeling a bit of distress, to have someone talk it through. Again, this idea of distraction, of kind of evening out the wave of the peak of the crisis. That can be really empowering for people. I know I've worked with individuals that started using the crisis line more often, and just in general, their suicidal ideation went down. They felt like they had more support and were coping better. So last step, which is probably where most of the action is at, where we know that we're pretty effective here if we do a good job with this, is limiting access to means. And then I want to also talk about a bonus purpose, sort of the flip of thinking about step 6, are reminders for reasons for living. So we're going to get at how to do that. So the idea here is, and I always talk about it, sometimes veterans will bring up, it's impossible to make an entirely safe home environment, right? If we think about all the possible ways or means by which people could choose to kill themselves, there's no way we could take everything out of the home. There would be just like the walls, and probably still somehow that could be dangerous to some individuals. So what you really want to tune into is what are the specific methods that they've thought about using, that they've engaged in preparatory behaviors for, that they have means for that, and really key into that. And so that's the first place to start. And what I talk about is this idea of, again, buying yourself time. And we're going to switch into a case here for a second, but you know, it's not necessarily that we need to remove everything from the home. Someone will say, well, then I can just go somewhere else and do these things. And I said, you're right. But we know when our problem solving is offline and we're not doing our best thinking, if we can make it harder for you to get your hands on something immediately, then we're going to buy time. And then your problem solving can come back in on play, which is really helpful. But what I know is this happens a lot, especially in Denver. I'm not sure about here in Seattle. If you think about even our case that we had, but they say, you know, there's no way you're taking away my guns. Like, no way. I'm not removing the guns. What do you guys do next? How would you handle this? So I'm hearing gun locks, safe, ammunition. I think someone's safe to take it. Yeah, exactly. So I think this is sort of a sticky point, and right away people kind of snap at this. And so I talk about, let's think about a range of options that are available, which are many of these things that you guys are talking about.
Yeah, one of the things I do is ask if they have a friend that they would feel comfortable having the guns for a while.
Right, so friends that they trust, that they could just have them take the guns for a small amount of time. Yeah. So a lot of these work, I always think about it as options. So if you think about it like a buffet, I have found myself wanting to eat everything on a buffet, but the idea is there are options for you to pick that are best for you. So when it comes to firearms or weapons, for example, is it that we need to get rid of them? Is it that they need to be out of the house? Or could it be something like a trigger lock, a gun safe, ammunition stored separately from the weapon? And I tell them about this idea of, let's say you have a loaded firearm that's sitting right at your bedside table next to your bed. How long is it going to take you to do something with that gun versus if we had it separated ammunition, sort of locked up in one place or the other, and they get it. And so they start to buy into this idea, okay, they're not just trying to remove my weapons or whatever it happens to be. It's this notion of buying myself time. But I also like to highlight, even for individuals that don't have trouble with alcohol and drugs, is those things are never good to have around in terms of just our thinking. So if they're at a particularly sensitive time period, to think about that. Asking for help, a couple of recent examples, an individual that had thoughts about overdosing would have their significant other help administer the medications on a day-to-day basis. There's another creative one where individual is having a substance abuse problem, and if they were allowed to have more money each day at the beginning of the day, then they would just use it at the end of work to buy some stuff from the liquor store on the way home. So bringing in his wife into the plan, she made sure to just give him sort of enough money during the short-term period so that he had enough for lunch, that he didn't have anything left over. And so the bonus thing that I had talked about is things that you can add to the environment to remind you of reasons for living. I think this can be key, and sometimes we don't always think about this for the safety plan. So is that photographs? Is it mementos of some sorts? Is it lyrics, quotes? Something that helps them remember that they have that reason for living. And making sure that that's up in their home, in their environment. And then we also talk about putting those in places where they may be storing the ammunition or storing the weapon or storing the medication, so that can be an extra stimulus to remind them in that moment, oh yeah, I've forgotten about this, but that's pretty important to me. So I want to highlight it in that theme of the various apps that we have. There's this thing called Virtual Hope Box, which you can also make one of these sort of with a shoebox, or it can be anything, but this is the new age version of it on the phone. But basically what this does is sort of that whole idea of the reasons for living. It can pull in pictures, phone numbers, contacts, quotes, all these things all in one place in the app that the person can go to, which helps them remember, hey, these are the things that keep me going. These are the things that are really important to me. So a person can have this virtual version of that, or they could actually construct one to have at home. And that's usually pretty empowering and helpful to people. So the next piece is really the implementation. So assessing people's comfort, their intention to use it, and problem solving around some of these common barriers here. So people talk about how it's difficult to reach out to others, so we troubleshoot, well, what if you shared a plan before? How can we come up with a game plan for that? Sometimes people are like, I don't like this name of the safety plan. I'm like, this sucks, like that's dumb. And I'm like, let's rename it. Let's cross it off. Even let's put it on another piece of paper of a name that works for you. But you wouldn't think like that wouldn't be one that you necessarily would bring up. But that can be even important as well. Like, does this form fit for you? Do you feel like this is comfortable, part of something that you would use? And something as basic as the name may deter someone. And then it's this concept of don't remember to use it, it will get lost. We often do these, of course, on the inpatient unit, and people are getting like so much paper. It's just another paper on that stack. So how can you work with people to make it in some form that would be helpful for them? So is that taking a picture of it so that it's on their cell phone at all times? Is it sizing it down in a brief way so that it can fit into their wallet, laminating it, making various copies. So even taking time with that can be really helpful. So we talked about sharing. One thing for a location of the safety plan can also be a way to sort of supercharge or boost it, helping people think about where can they put it so that they remember to keep reviewing it. Because the whole idea, which we're going to next, is practice, practice, practice. If you go back to the stop, drop, and roll, you need to practice that to overcome. So people have been really creative. They may put it like on the back of their front door so that every day before they're leaving, they look at it. Had individuals that I work with that put it on their fridge so that every time they go into the fridge, they're looking at it again. Had one guy that was talking about who was living in a residential facility with other people, and so he didn't want it out and about, which makes sense. This can be really private. And so he talks about like putting it in an envelope in a napkin holder where he sat, and every time he had a meal, he'd open it up and look at it. So again, being really creative and helping people think about how they can review the plan can be so helpful as well. So this is kind of a reiteration of things that we talked about, but I think your comfort, and that's why we spent so much time today reviewing the safety plan, really makes the safety plan be the supercharged state. So if you're comfortable with it, if you're familiar with it, if you can ebb and flow even between the steps, it'll make it that fluid process. One thing I want to highlight again is this idea of the recovery method of really highlighting people's strengths and building that in as hope, even within the safety plan, can be really powerful. And then if you are working long-term with these individuals, how can you use interventions for each step as well? So how can you improve or buffer their coping strategies? How can you help, especially if there's those perceptions of burdensomeness and poor belongingness, to really attack step 3 and 4? So it's both helping in the acute, but also you can think about long-term interventions for each of these. So we had in the back some of the safety plan quick guides, so this can be helpful, something to have at your desk that really goes through all of them. Then also this is part of that safety plan brochure as well, making sure that you're evaluating, helping people know that they need to constantly be updating their safety plan. Things will change. And then reviewing it periodically. These are some resources, which again, these slides will be available, but there's the treatment manual that you can download, the quick guide, which is what we have out front, but you can also get a version of that online. There's also an app as well. So this is a particular one just to safety planning. So this can incorporate the phone numbers already, a lot of these coping strategies. So people are tech savvy, that's a nice one as well. So here's a look at how you can have the coping strategies built in. There's things that they can choose from. Here's what the reach out looks like. They can choose the settings of what their own photos that they want, a message they can record themselves to play, certain music, videos. So that was the sort of quick version of the safety planning. How about any questions? Concerns about using the safety plan?
We will often see veterans whose safety plan after safety plan will not have social supports.
I mean, also, I think, you know, the idea that if you continue not to have anybody, perhaps you need social skills training, right? And then what is going on that you don't have people in your life? And then that is, you know, probably a good thing to focus on in terms of an evidence-based
There'll be
treatment.
individuals that have safety plan after safety plan on the chart with the social support just missing, and that's not being built. So yeah, I think that one, it's very common, and so that's something that I'll talk with the veteran about, that hey, like lots of people are in the same boat. So I start in terms of different interventions that could work. I think if they're on like an inpatient unit, is there someone that you've met that you feel comfortable with? Sometimes that can be a way to lead in. If there are certain groups, thinking about fostering them, sort of recovery groups as well is another way to build in. But I think for interventions in terms of working with individuals one-on-one, it's sort of coping and strategies around that. So what's the reason why people aren't on there? Is it because there's these perceptions there? Is it because they're not hanging around the right people, and sort of targeting that within intervention work that the two of you have?
Battle buddies, people they served with.
Yeah, battle buddies, people they served with. That's a common one that people feel comfortable with.
This idea that they don't have to be like, you know, someone right there, giving someone away.
Yeah, that's a good one too. People think that it has to be someone local, which isn't necessarily the case, that they can be somewhere else and still serve that role. Other things to think about, even for a distraction, Things like kids can actually be really great. So if you think about step 3, you're not disclosing that you're in a crisis. It's just for distraction, kind of shooting the breeze with someone. So if you call up, like my niece, and I asked her like, hey, what'd you eat today? She'd like go on for like 10 minutes about like various things that she ate throughout the day. And again, it would just be that distraction piece. So sometimes even getting creative with it.